Good afternoon, everyone. The time is now 12:35. So we are going to officially start this Zoom webinar for you today. Again, for those that are joining in, my name is Shanti Das. I am the founder and executive director of Silence the Shame Incorporated. We have been in existence since 2017. We started under the name the Hip Hop Professional Foundation, but now we are the mighty Silence the Shame movement and nonprofit. We are grateful to be able to do work in the space of mental health and wellness, particularly in communities of color. So today we present to you a community conversation mental health Q&A, managing grief and loss in a pandemic. And I urge you and encourage you to post your thoughts on social media. And we ask that if you do post, you utilize the hashtag Silence the Shame or hashtag MHQA, Mental Health Q&A. And these are a little bit different from the community conversations that we typically do. Usually there's a panel discussion and then we wait until the end for questions. But because this is a mental health Q&A, we want you guys to ask questions throughout. So I'll be looking in the chat room if you want to post your questions, or if you'd like to ask it via the microphone, just let me know. So I am super excited for our guest clinician today, Dr. Ajita Robinson, and I have to give special thanks to Dr. Joy from Therapy for Black Girls who connected us. So how are you, Dr. Robinson?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me, for hosting this conversation. And I think, again, just creating this space, it's so important. And so I'm doing really well. Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you for being here. Can you give us just a little bit of background information about yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor in Maryland, DC, and Missouri, but I'm based in Maryland now. I'm a grief and trauma expert. And so I focus on cumulative losses and cumulative trauma, namely in African American communities, but obviously we work with clients across the lifespan and variety of different backgrounds. And so I lead a team of 21 clinicians here in the DMV area. Okay. And in addition to that, I also serve as a professor in the counseling department at the University of Southern California. And so grief and trauma are things that impact all of us. And so it's really important that we understand how our own history of grief and trauma is being compounded by this pandemic and the ways that it might show up for us, both individually, but also collectively.
Absolutely. Thank you. I will start by saying, and these numbers are just what, some of the projections that I'm receiving from CNN. Dr. Robinson, looks as if it's over 128,000 deaths globally. And then in the United States, they are reporting over 26,000 deaths. And we're seeing news reports where those numbers vary, obviously from state to state. Unfortunately, some numbers, I think, even in some of the underserved communities, are not being reported properly. But what I can say for a fact is that, these are unprecedented times. We've seen other viruses and other things affect our community, but the rate that this virus has been killing off our loved ones, our families, our friends, our colleagues. It is devastating, quite honestly. So many people, haven't been able to have proper funerals or burials, or, they've been limiting the funerals to 10 people, which, especially in the African American community, funerals, it's a celebration of life, right? And there's so many rituals that go into the memorials and celebrating our loved ones. Can you talk about that effect that it's, I'm sure it's had on so many communities, and what can you say to some of these families that have lost friends and colleagues and loved ones during this pandemic?
Absolutely. I think that the numbers are underreported because we just don't know, and data is only good as the data that we have, right? Our ability to disseminate that. I think that the interruption of rituals, the interruption of the celebration of life, my concern is that it prolongs the grieving process, that it delays it. For many of us, preparing the body, seeing the body going through the ceremony brings the reality of loss to the present moment. For many of us, we're able to kind of deny that it is the reality of the loss,
Mm,
particularly when it's the death of a loved one. And it is usually the wake and the funeral where we physically see our loved one being laid to rest, that that piece really comes full circle. And so my concern is that the not only the prolonged kind of nature of this, the distance that is created in our ability to grieve and honor our loved ones, and the compounded impact of not knowing how long this social distancing or physical distancing is going to go on, not knowing what really happened to our loved ones and their experience in those final moments, not being able to bear witness and hold space for them as they transition, and then not being able to honor that loss will create prolonged and complex bereavement. I think that on top of our histories of loss, the instability and the loss of safety that this situation is creating, I think is really disproportionately impacting those who are already bereaved, right? Already who were grieving loss of income, loss of safety, loss of stability, and now you have a physical loss that you also can't go through the process of honoring. Many of us create community around losses, right? Both online and in person. And
mhm.
the in person connection that grounds us in our communities, in our safe places, we are able to engage in. And so, again, I think it's minimizing and amplifying the gaps in our support and the ways that we take care of ourselves. And so, what would I say to those families and those communities who are grieving? Is to give yourself permission to feel whatever shows up. I think we oftentimes get so busy in our day to day that we push through the normal feelings of grief because they're uncomfortable. We don't like to sit in that space.
Mhm.
That it is so important that we just give ourselves permission to not be okay, particularly those of us who are caregivers, right? Formally and informally, we're used to doing, to being, to giving,
Mhm.
and we're likely burning ourselves out. This is becoming evident in this new climate.
Right.
Um, I think it's also important that we're intentional and that we're creative about the way that we create community with our family and our loved ones, because we do need to honor the loss. We need to celebrate life. And so we may have to bring those celebrations online in a platform like Zoom, online in a face group, but something that honors that there's a loss that has occurred, that it's a shared loss so that we
Mhm.
can name it. We can't heal from that which we don't name,
That's right.
the physical and the symbolic losses that we're experiencing. And so sometimes we just need other people to bear witness to those feelings, to that experience. And creating community in a virtual space is going to be so important because we can't physically get together. Um, I think that it's also important to honor our pain and not just push through it. Again, we're used to being busy, we're used to creating, some
Uh-oh.
dissonance.
What happened?
Um,
Okay.
we are
Sorry.
used to kind of just keep moving, right? Our society reinforces that.
Mhm.
And right now we're literally standing still and we need to. And so sitting with what shows up. Um, Again, I would just like to remind people, particularly those who are grieving the loss of someone who has died, to understand that the physical connection is what has ended. The relationship never dies. And so,
Mhm.
what are the ways that we can stay anchored in that connection in ways that feel good? Because in the beginning of a loss, it may be too much, right,
Mhm.
to truly honor and to re-engage in the relationship, because it looks different in the aftermath of death. And so, at some point in our grief journey, when we're ready, when we feel capable, when we feel that we're able to access it, to reimagine that relationship post loss,
Mhm.
to renew that connection. I think that's going to be important.
Thank you. I have one other question I'd like for you to maybe share in about 2 minutes, and then we're going to go into the chat room to take some questions from the participants. Can you talk about the grief cycle? One of the things that I learned from my sister is I didn't even know there was a grief cycle, but the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. I don't know if it's 5 or 7 stages, but could you take us through those stages?
So there's kind of five main stages. I also want to kind of preface this conversation that we're going to talk about it in cycles and stages, but to remember that grief is not linear.
Right.
We don't go through these stages or cycles or process in any one way. In fact, many of us actually toggle through different spaces. We might be in these different areas simultaneously, right? And so we might circle back through them. And so I think that piece is important. because we've traditionally thought, at least from a foundational perspective, as grief as a linear process. And so it set people up to think that there was an end. And for many of us, grief is a lifelong experience. And I think the conversations that we briefly had, Shanti, you certainly can attest to this. And so I just want to give some overview. There's kind of five main kind of foundational spaces that grief theorists agree on, right? I think that piece is important. And so denial. So just the not accepting that a loss has actually occurred. So we're just kind of denying it. And sometimes this happens at at the end of life, right? When our loved one is dying more actively than others. And certainly it can happen when someone has actually died. And so it really is not being able to wrap our mind around that they are no longer here, right? That they're no longer living, that this has happened. And so denial is a normal and natural part of the grief process. It's also why that ceremony, the funeral, is so important, is because it grounds us in the reality of the loss. Anger, and this one we recognize. We recognize anger. It is very protective. It gets a bad rap. Anger is often the surface emotion, and we might be angry with ourselves, with the healthcare provider, with God. Sometimes it's safer to be angry with God than to be angry with our loved one. I remember one of your guests, Bishop T.D. Jakes, mentioned that piece. I thought that was really profound. But we recognize anger. It's an emotion that we are comfortable with. It's easier for us to name and to display than it is to express sorrow and sadness, right? And depression, and just the very kind of core of feeling empty. We don't recognize those as easily as we recognize anger. And it's a necessary part of the grieving process. It exists on the continuum of emotions. And then bargaining. Again, this can happen as our loved one is beginning to transition, and so they're physically still here, or even after the loss has occurred, where we might begin to negotiate with ourselves, with our higher power, with the universe, whomever, that if we just did this, I'll give up this if you could just save my loved one. I'll stop doing this or whatever. It is that negotiating and really trying to have a sense of control over what's happening. And then there's depression. Again, depression looks differently for all of us. Sometimes depression looks like overwhelming sadness, loss of interest, decreased concentration, increased or decreased eating. It might look like increased sleeping or loss of sleep. And so again, depression doesn't mean that it means clinical depression. It just means that we are feeling our mood has decreased, right? And we might see that psychologically, mentally, emotionally, right, on a few different, and physically on a few different areas. And then acceptance. And so this comes to, we come to a place where we're able to accept that the loss has occurred, which is different from meaning making. And so acceptance was traditionally the kind of last stage in the Kubler-Ross model. We understand kind of in grief theory that what really allows us to create meaning and make meaning post-loss is being able to find renewal and to find a gift in our experience, not in the loss itself, but in what life looks like post the loss. Many of us have established foundations and movements and organizations and scholarships in the name of honoring a loved one, and that is some of the meaning making that we're able to do. Some of us reclaim a new way of walking in the world. We're able to reaffirm our purpose, reconnect with relationships that we weren't intentional about, create boundaries around relationships that aren't aligned with what life looks like post-loss, find renewed purpose and energy for life. And that is the gift and the meaning-making aspect that can occur post-loss. Again, it doesn't mean that we won't cycle back through those. Anniversaries, milestones, all can re-trigger us to grieve. We might go back and be in denial that I cannot believe that I'm celebrating my graduation, or I'm celebrating my marriage, or I'm celebrating a milestone without my loved one. Never would I have imagined I would be living life without my oldest brother, right? Never would I have imagined that I'd be celebrating a birthday without him. And so all of those things, new losses, any triggers, anniversaries, milestones, holidays, can send us back through our grief journey. And that's another reason that I emphasize that it is it is a lifelong journey, right? And so that can be disconcerting for some, and for others, it gives them permission to grieve in the way that they need to because we don't put a time limit on grief.
Mm-hmm.
But it is important to understand that it is lifelong. The difference for many of us is that we adjust to life post loss at some point, right? And that there's times where that loss is more acute than others. The way that we carry that loss and what life looks like in the aftermath is the thing that we adjust to. It isn't the loss itself that we ever fully accept. We just reimagine what life looks like, renew our purpose on life in the aftermath of what life looks like now.
Absolutely. And I'm going to come back to that about triggers and anniversaries. I would like to go into the chat room now. I'll read from Dr. Brown. Hey, this is Dr. Brown from Richmond. Much needed conversation. Looking forward to hearing how we can manage our loss during these times, how to support others and seniors that are unable to participate in graduation ceremonies. And I certainly have a nephew who is a senior in high school, and he won't be able to walk down the aisle. Can you shed some light on like that symbolic loss?
One, I think we just need to honor that it is a loss because it is, in the scheme of things, it's easy to compare, right? That there's people who are losing their life, and then we have our adolescents and our teens missing graduation. But those are meaning-making events, right? They're holidays, they're celebrations of their life thus far. And the same way that we would honor the life of someone who has died, we need to honor the milestones that our graduates, our seniors are missing out on. And so I see a lot of folks creating these online ceremonies, but we need to do something that would honor our senior. And this is unique to each person, right? And so some of that might be having a virtual ceremony, giving them an opportunity to put on their cap and gown, to take pictures, again, being creative around that. And ideally having a future plan when life whenever life, right, returns to, I hope we don't ever return back to the way that things were, but whatever life looks like post this pandemic, that we at least affirm for our seniors and whomever, right, that might be experiencing losses in these celebrations and these milestone moments, that we fully intend to honor that celebration because it is important. And so sometimes just knowing that there will be a celebration can help us navigate the current loss. It is so important that we don't dismiss that they are grieving the loss of their identity as seniors, the loss of those moments, those milestones, those celebrations. And it's really important that we find ways to honor that. And so the ways in which we can do that now, right? And so that might even include just shouting them out and celebrating all of the things that they've accomplished thus far. I saw a few folks who created a virtual graduation for their people. I think things like that, you know what your team needs, involve them in that in the ways that make sense, but create an opportunity to celebrate that. It is important.
What about just any healthy coping mechanisms for the teens outside of the celebratory things that you can do from a family perspective? Because as we know, a lot of times teens, they don't talk to their parents. They'll talk to their peers and tell their peers how they're feeling, but they may not talk to their parents or their aunties and tell them they're having a hard time coping. Some of my nieces and nephews are a little bit more open to sharing, but a lot of our teens won't say anything, but something is going on. What can we do to help them with that? And should we consider therapy for them or family therapy or any healthy coping mechanisms?
Absolutely. I think I'm always biased to therapy. I think that it is important. It's safe space. But I also think group therapy can really be important because they are seeking connection and they're seeking connections with their peer group. They're experiencing some similar things, right? With, again, losing the structure of school, losing that friendship connection and that social piece, but they're also losing the opportunity to really form their identities that are separate from their families of origin, which is really what this phase of life is about for them. And so I think creating spaces, whether they're formal or informal, that's dedicated and protected for them is important. Group therapy or group support is a great way to do that. This certainly can happen through kind of therapists like myself, but also our churches, whatever their connection in the community already is, finding the ones that are willing to provide that space. You're right, they may not tell us as adults, but their behavior often tells the story. I always say this when it comes to kids, and including young adults and adolescents, is that they may not verbally tell us, but if you look at the changes in their behavior, both up and down, again, eating, concentration, sleep, those things, they tell the story. We notice it, we just may not have words. And so it's important that we help them find language to what they're feeling because they do need to express it. Our youth often need to be active. They're particularly boys, and this is also can be true for girls, but just a generalization, they need to be active in their grief. And so this is part of the reason that having an opportunity to kind of share their story. This can happen through music and dance and some of these creative things so that they can talk about what's happening because again, they often don't outright come out and say it, but they will if you give them an expressive outlet to do it. And so we've really been utilizing music, so them being able to create poems and lyrics to music. So we use a lot of kind of dance and music infused approaches to help them kind of tell and express their feelings because it's more comfortable for them. It's a step removed from I feel this way to being able to put it in a song or something like that. Yeah. I think it's also important, again, to give them some physical outlets. And so exercise is always really helpful because, again, grief is a full body experience. Kids aren't exempt from that. And so they often feel it in their body well before they're able to articulate what they're feeling. And so giving them outlets. And so, again, my kids like kickboxing and yoga, but that, again, could also be something, dance, again, is another physical expressive way that they can talk through. How do you feel the grief manifest in your body, right? Where does it sit? And giving them room, right, to put a song or something with that to express what that feels like. I do think that it's important that we pay attention to play, particularly with our younger kids, because that's how it shows up.
Pay attention to what?
To play, the way that they play and the stories that they tell, the way that they utilize their dolls or the pictures they draw. Because again, words isn't the language of kids, play is. And so we often force them to talk when really if we just give them some manipulatives, they'll tell us what's happening and what they're kind of preoccupied with. And so step into their world. I think that piece is important. And keep them hydrated and keep them rested even when it looks like their cycle's off. And so creating routines, structure is going to be the biggest thing that helps all of us, and this is especially true for youth and adolescents, is creating routines. The thing that this pandemic does is it disrupts the things that we can expect. It disrupts the things that we feel like we know, and that is at the core of safety, is knowing what to expect on a day-to-day basis, even if it's that we consistently have meals together at a certain time frame. It gives them something to ground in that they can feel certain about because there's so many things that have been just knocked from underneath them. I think that piece is important.
Those are great tips. I'm going to go now to a question from Pastor Eddie. He asked, what advice would you give when dealing with an elderly person who have just lost their life mate and are now isolated, which can be really difficult? And I want to shout out my mentor who's on the call, Vivian Scott Chu, who is an end-of-life doula, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And oftentimes, you know, she goes in to see families and helps the mate, you know, through that process. From a physical loss perspective, let's kind of go back to that for a second. What can we do for our senior, you know, folks that have lost their mate, which can be devastating, as you know? Absolutely.
And can certainly be wrapped in their sense of kind of purpose and identity when their peer group is no more. You know, normally we talk about surrounding them with community, surrounding them with things that they still look forward to, particularly towards the end of life. This is really important to keep them grounded. We know that keeping them grounded in the present day helps them with memory and buffering from things like dementia and Alzheimer's. And so those things are still true. We still need to center them with community and with support. And so this caretaking for them, I think, has to look different because they're older and ideally more vulnerable physically and emotionally. We want to be careful about the ways we enter their space. And so
Because
to the
of
extent
COVID-19, correct?
because of COVID-19. I mean, I think that's always the case,
Right.
but it is amplified because of COVID-19. And so the normal things that we would do is to be physically present. We may not be able to do if we're not already a part of their care team. And so we would really want to partner with who already has access. That ideally is taking the necessary precautions. So if there's someone that's already been sheltering in place with them, we want to coordinate with them. And we might do some of the same meaning making things, right? So honoring that person's life with that person. Storytelling is a really big part, particularly for our elders, because um, they may not be making new memories. Some of them, particularly if they're at an active stage of end of life, they may not be making new memories. And so it's so important that they have a space to do life review, right? And so that is the storytelling, the narrative work that we're doing at end of life anyway. What is their impact and legacy? And so they may need to tell that part of their story. And so it's really important that we just create space for people to tell their stories, especially those who are navigating end of life, because they're not rewriting at that stage.
Yeah.
They're literally just retelling the
Right.
ways in which they've navigated life. And that becomes especially important in the face of another loss. It also keeps them grounded in connection. And so just be fully present in the ways that we can provide substances to them, right? And so giving them insight into your world because they're not creating new meaning. They find great value in being welcomed into your story. And so that piece is important. Asking them questions, authentically giving them space to share wisdom. Interestingly enough, our folks who are often at the end of life, it's really important that they've had an impact on others. And so they may need to be able to share that and to impart those pieces. Our traditional things such as, providing food if we can. And again, just checking in on them, I think regularly. And so again, having a schedule so that they know what to expect. And so if they know that you're their check-in person Wednesday morning, be present Wednesday morning, right? Be honor that consistency because they need something that's stable, right? Because they've lost a significant, right, amount of things. Yeah.
And then some of our seniors, are in facilities. Like my mother has Alzheimer's. And speaking from a loss of just connectivity with the family, I'm grateful that her facility has purchased iPads for the caregivers.
Yes.
And so I call once a week. We have to go through their schedule, but I schedule a call once a week for my mom for that connectivity, so she's not feeling the loss of the human connection, if you will, with her family members. So thank you for that.
And that can be something to look forward to, right? It's those moments that we know once a week I'm going to get to speak to my daughter. That helps me feel connected, loved, and cared for, and seen. Because a lot of our seniors feel invisible in a lot of ways. They feel forgotten about. And so the ways that we can honor that we see them, that we love them, that we care for them, and just taking out once a week and doing that consistently can really bring that full circle.
Absolutely. I'm going to go now to a question from Paul. The question is, do you think the pandemic season presents a greater effect on grief, even for deaths that are not connected to COVID? Because I've talked to friends and family members that have loved ones in the hospital totally non-related to COVID, but they can't even see them, as they're getting treatment. So of course, when someone, I'm sure, passes away, that can, cause, just definitely a greater effect on what's going on because of the pandemic.
Absolutely. It disrupts our journey, right? And so even if our loved one is in the hospital, generally, I don't know about you all, but when my grandfather was in the hospital, he was in the hospital for 11 days. There was a caring for him that we were able to do all the way leading up to his death, right? Just being able to bear witness to that he was receiving the best care, right? Particularly for, us African Americans or Black people, where we might already have histories with healthcare that aren't positive. We often need someone there that can advocate to make sure that we are comfortable with the care that they're receiving, that we are comfortable with their prior history being noted and being taken care of, and that they're not being forgotten about. And so our grief is being compounded because those questions that we already have in a normal setting are amplified because we have to trust a system that we already don't necessarily fully trust. And so that can compound the grief process. Even when our loved one doesn't die, right? It can create a sense of grief, because grief really is about loss. It could be loss of control, loss of certainty, loss of our identity. I've been a caregiver all my life. And so not being able to physically go and be with my grandmother and make sure that I'm asking all the questions, that I can see her, right? We talk about this laying eyes on folks, or we gathered in prayer around my grandfather's bed, and that was important, right? Because as a God girl, it was important that he knew that we were present, that we hadn't given up, that we had called God into the room. And so yeah, we can do that from afar, but it's a different way of being when you can create that sacred space with your loved one, and to be able to show up. There's something really important about physically being able to show up so that your loved one knows that they've not been forgotten, that they've not been abandoned, and that we at least know in their final moments they weren't in pain, they weren't by themselves. We helped them transition, and that is compounding a lot of this. A lot of those are rituals and routines that we just have. Think about not only the person who is in the hospital, but the person, their spouse, right? We provide wraparound care for them in those moments, right? We make sure that they're not alone, that they're fed, that they're, doing hygiene stuff. Again, we can't do those things, and that absolutely compounds the grief, because one of the things that helps us navigate grief is connection to others, both the physical and the symbolic connections. And the physical piece, we're not able to tap into the ways in which we traditionally have. We're having to compensate using technology, but our body knows that there's a disconnect. And so we are feeling that weight. It's part of the reason that many of us are feeling exhausted, right? Many of us are feeling like we're sleeping maybe the adequate number of hours, but we're not waking up refreshed, because our body is trying to figure out why we're activated, but we're at home and we're safe, because there's a disconnect between what's happening and what we're processing and what we're physically experiencing.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to an earlier comment. Billy says, how do I manage guilt and anger and grief? And if I can just share briefly, some of you know that may know me, but almost a year ago, it's going to be a year on Saturday, and my sister passed away. And I'm so angry, Dr. Robinson all over again. And just these triggers, looking at the photos and the Facebook memories that are popping up. I went through grief counseling from a program called griefshare.org, which is a really good resource. But just, I keep rehashing, what happened. She was on vacation in Cancun, and we think it was a blood clot that led to a stroke, and everything is just so present again. And I feel like not that I'm relapsing, and I don't feel depressed, but it's such a hard week for me. And I can't really get a grip on the anger right now. And I don't blame God, but I'm just, if I can be really frank, I'm pissed off that my sister's not here, because she meant so much to me. It was much more than just a sister relationship. And I came up with this new definition of grief last year. So for me, grief means going right into extreme faith. If I had not utilized my faith, I wouldn't even be sitting here present to be able to host and moderate this webinar. But it can be debilitating. And it's interesting, my sister was going to get her master's. Well, she gotten her master's actually, and was about to become an LPC, and she was doing some focus work on grief and loss, and she was featured on a Silence to Shame podcast. And she said, once you can get past the debilitating part of the grief process, and for some it takes longer, as you said, everyone experiences grief differently, but then you can finally start honoring your loved one. And it's just taking a lot longer than I had anticipated in terms of the anger. Can you talk a little bit about just managing that process of the anger and the guilt, and all of those emotions that they come back up for us?
I think that it takes a lot of courage to fully experience your grief process. We're so used to numbing things out with distractions, and that's adaptive, but it doesn't allow us to fully grieve and honor the thing that we lost. Anger, again, is normal. It's a normal reaction. So I wouldn't I wouldn't attempt to not be angry. I would attempt to name the anger, right? We're angry that. And we get to be angry. We get to be angry that we're experiencing this thing without our loved one, right? I keep thinking about what my brother would be saying right now, right? All the memes we would be trading back and forth and that. So I use humor as a way to kind of cope. I know that my grandfather would be saying everything but nice words about how this whole situation has been managed. And so, again, that for me, that's meaning making. That's that connection piece. Am I angry that they left me here by myself? That's a thing that comes up. I'm
Yeah.
absolutely upset that I have to navigate life without the two people who anchored me, right, on my journey, that gave me permission to take risk in because they were going to be there, right? And so that piece is so important to be able to say it and to not feel guilty about being angry. Here's the thing is that your loved one, your relationship with them, your relationship with God can handle you being angry. And so give yourself permission to do that, to be that, to express it and to share it. I think guilt comes about because we think we have more control than we actually do.
Mm.
And so we have to release ourselves from feeling like we have control. And that is, unanchoring, because there's a lot of fear in saying, I'm not in control and I never was. But there's a peace that can come from knowing that, particularly those of us who are God people and faith-based folks or spiritual people, understanding that we did the best that we could. I think the thing that is also important is in the present moment, making sure that you are fully present in your relationships to the extent that you can be.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that has been really helpful for me in grieving my grandfather in particularly is knowing that there was nothing undone. There were memories I would have loved to be able to create with him, but there was nothing that needed to be said. He knew exactly how I felt about him. Our relationship was healthy and positive and whole. And so there's a sense of peace that can come there. I think a lot of us experience significant grief and profound grief that gets complicated or we get stuck. We call it frozen grief when there are undone tasks in the relationship. And so it's important that even without their physical presence, we reconcile the pieces that feel left, right? And we can do that work without our loved ones' involvement. Sometimes it's because physically they are not good people to be in our life, and so we still need to grieve that relationship. They're still walking the world, but we can't be in communication or connection with them because of the wounding that causes. And then other times it's because we are grieving their physical loss because they're no longer here. And so I think giving ourselves permission to seek support around that, wherever support looks like, right? Your good friends who are good listeners and holders of space, seeking out therapists, your pastors, whomever you know can create that space, but also hold you accountable to not pushing through this process. Grief a lot of times is about control because we think there's something that we could have done. And so making peace with that we likely did everything that we could for our loved one.
Thank you. All of that is so true. And Jackie says that I think it's okay to sit in the pain as long as we get out of it and work on moving forward. And that's what I've been doing. I will say that, probably the first 6 months, I cried a lot every day, uncontrollable crying. I would be sitting at the red light driving and just burst into tears. But I've gotten to a point where I have been able to find pathways forward. But I will say that when I feel like crying, I sit in that moment. Yes, Jackie, I agree with you. I am on Instagram a lot. I use my platform through shooting videos and just talking to my followers about the pain that I'm going through, because I feel like, we have to show all sides of life, right? It shouldn't just be everything all rosy. And so I just chose to use that platform to share. So you might come on my Instagram one day and get an ugly cry, but at the end, I'm also gonna, give you some joy and give you some hope, and, because hope is not canceled. And that's the one thing, right. This grieving process, especially being in a pandemic, being isolated, to your point, Dr. Robinson, when I'm having a moment, I call my friends, or, I might text my pastor, Dr. Raphael G. Warnock of Ebenezer. He's quick to respond back to me because he was there when I went through my own depression 5 years ago before my sister passed away. So, Lakeisha says it's also important to remember grief doesn't have a time limit.
Does not.
It is a lifelong journey. We said that there will never be a day that goes by that I don't miss my sister and other loved ones that have passed away. This one just hit me a little bit differently because I've never experienced grief of a loss of someone that was like within my, my core 3 people in my life.
Yep.
And it's just been truly devastating, but I am allowing myself to grieve and to go through the process and to seek help virtually right now, even though I can't have that physical connection. And there, I'm sure, are a lot of virtual support groups, right? Just like there are support groups for AA and other things. Make sure that you're reaching out to organizations like NAMI.org or griefshare.org, like I mentioned, and I'm sure Dr. Robinson can list some resources. So we're right at about 1:15. We have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to see if there's some other quick questions we can go to. Pastor Eddie says, what suggestion would you give for college students that feel disconnected from their normal lives and may have some other underlying mental health challenges?
So I think that the being able to still identify from as a student when you're not in school is a tough thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think giving opportunities for them to connect with that identity. Some folks are in a space in their grief where they need to be active, and so seeking out opportunities that allow them to solidify some of those skill sets. Because one of the things that they're kind of, I think, feeling afraid of is the loss of job opportunities, but to know that those aren't all lost, the loss of the stability for their future, but also that connection with others. And so reaching out to your faculty, reaching out to your university counseling center, because they can help you connect with the other students who are, again, I think shared experience, shared community is very powerful. And then finding that connection. Social media can be really powerful with helping us feel connected to one another. But it doesn't, that connection doesn't prevent us or exempt us from needing to address whatever the underlying issues are. And so that it's more important, even especially now, that we get some support and some help around identifying what those underlying issues are and developing some coping. I think it's also important that we understand that our coping mechanisms that work for us during normal times, right, or in kind of life before COVID, may feel like they're failing us now. We might need something completely different. Again, be curious about what your body is telling you it needs, right? I've always been a midday napper. It's just what I need, particularly because I do grief and trauma work. I'm on 2-a-day naps right now. And yes, part of that has because I've experienced some depression and just holding this space and my own grief history. And the other piece is that, again, it's a full body experience. Energy is different during this time. Productivity is different. And so lean into that, but also creating routines and rituals. Our college students need that. I want to kind of highlight something that showed up, I think, in the previous 2 comments that, and even kind of in your sharing. Grief, again, does not have a time limit on it. And sometimes it catches us off guard. Oftentimes this is what happens because it sits right alongside joy. It sits right alongside hope. They're the same side of the same coin. Think about these big milestones that you've had, and the first person you want to call is your loved one. Yes. And it brings to full circle that they're not there. And so I think it's important that we don't measure how well we're grieving by the absence of sadness, by the absence of crying, because those are normal emotions to feel, both in times where we're happy, but understanding that grief and loss can sit right alongside some amazing accomplishments in our life and in our business. And so don't think that we're not grieving well because it shows up. It's just a part of that journey. The thing is that it becomes less disruptive to our everyday functioning once we've had an opportunity to make meaning and gain some acceptance. But that doesn't exempt us from cycling back and feeling devastated all over again. Our recovery time, so to speak, as we navigate this process seems to shorten, but to just not push through that. I think it's also important, someone mentioned in the comments, of not kind of just sitting in that place of pain. I think we carry it with us. We learn to carry it differently. And that is actually the thing that we're wanting to kind of seek, is that we're not looking for the absence of it. We're just looking for it to not just completely wipe us out.
Mhm.
right? And so developing coping around it until we can find new meaning in it. That is the goal. And so that looks like stabilization on a grief journey. And so getting to a place where we're able to re-engage in our hygiene rituals, getting to a place where we're able to reconnect and feel a range of emotions that are outside of sadness, anger, and guilt, right? We want to be able to feel the entire spectrum. And so a lot of us, connection, community, expressing the loss will help us on that journey.
Thank you. And we have two more quick questions I'm going to try to get to. Billy just asked regarding going right into extreme faith, which I mentioned. How do you do that after death? What do you mean? Because I did that before my dad passed. I understand, and I hope I'm understanding your question. I think I understand rather. So yes, I prayed all the time for God to cover my family, my loved ones. Not in a million years did I expect my sister to pass away, but I don't necessarily blame God, because I feel like I know we all have a birth date and we all have a date that we're going to leave this world. We're not guaranteed, eternal life here on earth based on the faith that I believe in, Billy. I'm not sure what denomination or what you happen to believe in, but for me, because I do believe in eternal life, and I believe that my God, his son, died for our sins so that we can have eternal life. So I feel like being able to lean on him and allowing him to allow me to get the help that I may need while I'm still here, whether that's calling a therapist, seeking help, not using, casual cocktails always as a coping mechanism, because we know alcohol can be a depressant, but, I do have my cocktails every now and then, but I just try to ask God to help me through this situation. And so I'm constantly praying more and asking him for that. And I'm not necessarily blaming him for my sister's death, because I know that I'm going to die one day. I don't know the time nor the hour that it will happen, but I do still believe in, the one, God that I have always believed in. And so that's how I'm able to go into extreme faith. I know it can be different for everyone else, but, happy to talk to you offline about that. But that's just kind of what I believe. I'm going to quickly get to Paul's question. Do you have suggestions for people that are experiencing loss that isn't related to death during the pandemic? I am experiencing people that they're seeing their relationships differently now that they have to spend every waking moment together. They're feeling a sense of loss, maybe of their own identities and of self, because you love your mate and your partner, but that's a lot as well, right? When you kind of lose your identity and the time that you had individually, and that you always around, your spouse or your significant other or your partner 24/7. And that can be, a symbolic loss as well when you lose your identity somewhat.
Absolutely. So symbolic losses are ones that do not involve death, or the physical loss of, let's say, a limb or those things, but they're loss of identity, loss of control, loss of safety, loss of our role in relationships, right? Might trigger, and it can trigger the same grief process, but there's no physical loss that we um, are kind of honoring. But it is important to honor that, again, the grief process looks the same. It can sometimes be harder to recognize that we are grieving, or to at least give ourselves permission to grieve, because no one died, right? And so I think that piece is important, is to understand that we do grieve physical and symbolic losses in the cycle, or the different aspects that we have to navigate through to get to a space of acceptance, is important. And so I always recommend folks to identify what their needs are, particularly in relationships right now. We're seeing a lot. We're seeing that the inquiries for divorce is up 80%. And so, one, we're not alone. And two, try not to make any major decisions. If we're not physically, spiritually, and emotionally being harmed, let's take a step back and identify what our needs look like now. I think really engaging in clear and transparent communication, renegotiating with your partner, because their needs might be different than yours. And it doesn't mean that you love them or like them any less.
Mm-hmm.
Potentially, right? We might be recognizing that the person that we are quarantined with isn't the person we are meant to be with. And so that's a self-reflection piece. That's a journey that we need to go on to really clarify what our desires are, what our needs are for ourselves, because this might be amplifying that those have changed. Again, it may be that our partner hasn't pivoted with us, and we need to have a conversation about reimagining our relationship and our connection to one another. I think creating boundaries, particularly in relationships, gets a bad rap, but it's healthy, right? We don't want to be enmeshed with our loved ones because we want to keep our identities intact while we're in connection with others, and that is possible. Again, that it is important that we communicate that this is something that we need for ourselves, right? And so that could be that we need dedicated time each day where we are just, as solo as we can be. And it might be that you are watching your own show, or, you're doing whatever the activity is, or you need some quiet time. That's a negotiation, right? That's you communicating what your needs are. I think that it's important, again, if you are grounded in faith or spiritual, to identify what it is that your body, that you're asking of yourself, and before communicating that to your partner, and so that we communicate it from a space that isn't based on deficit, right? And so we meet our own needs first, and then we identify what those needs are in relationship with our partner. But that it is natural that we might grieve a sense of freedom. Going away for 8 hours or whatever a day gives us room to miss our partners, and we're not getting that. And so we might need to negotiate, where we hang out in the house, if we're working or not working, so that we feel that autonomy that we need, right? That sense of individuality that we need in relationship. And so I think communication is always key, so that internal dialogue as well as what we express to our partners.
Absolutely. And the final question from Natasha is, isolation can lead to depression, which can also turn to anger/lashing out. Do you have some suggestions to connect with family who could be negative to talk to, whether it's, you're dealing with grief from the loss of a family member or some of these symbolic losses that we've been talking about?
So again, I'll address the part around dealing with family members who might negatively impact our sense of wellness. Again, boundaries are your best friends. Boundaries, not ghosting, not passive aggression, right? And so holding boundaries might look like, I know that you might need to communicate this. I can't have this conversation. Right. And so just being able to honor, so, okay, this person, it isn't good for me to talk to this person about that, is to just be able to say that, to say, I don't agree, and then change the topic, right? Or limit the conversation. And so it might be a quick check-in. I have a uncle that I call on three-way because he can't be trusted on a solo call. It's just what it is. But I have a need to connect with him. And so I contact him with my mom on the phone because he's on better behavior when she's present, right? And so that piece, again, that's a boundary. I don't do one-on-one calls with him because he doesn't behave in a way that is aligned with the way I want to be talked to. And so my mom can referee that conversation, and I don't have to deal with the back end. I also still can feel connected to my uncle. And so again, it goes back to, what do you need in that relationship?
Yeah.
And negotiating those terms. I think it's important that we communicate what those terms are. Sometimes that hierarchy in families, right? So he's my great uncle. There's a respect factor there. I never do anything but that doesn't mean that I open myself up to be wounded, right? And so who is someone that can be an intermediary if that is something that could work with you? And my mom is willing to do that. And so that is how I take care of myself and meet the need around being connected to folks. For me, group calls are really helpful because, again, there's usually a senior or an elder there that can help moderate that. I'm usually the peacekeeper anyway, but I don't always want to be in that role. So having other people who witnessing the interaction usually helps keep folks in line. And you know what the dynamics are in your family. And so who might be able to help you negotiate that?
Yeah.
There's some folks that we can just text because they don't act right on the phone, right? So that's, again, we can just be honest about that and allow people to be good at what they're good at. We might need to change our expectations around who people can be in our space in this time period, because everyone is also grieving. I've been hearing a lot about folks saying things like, be mindful of the folks who didn't check in on you. You probably should be checking in on them, right? So let's not evaluate who people are in their totality in the midst of a crisis, right? Some of us emerge as our best self, but for others, we're overwhelmed and we're not able to show up in the ways that we would like to. And so just give folks grace. I think that's important.
Yeah, thank you. So we're coming up right on 2 minutes. I kind of want to recap. Again, you've been tuning in to managing grief and loss during a pandemic. with Dr. Ajita Robinson and myself, Shanti Das. We're going to list out some resources now. I just want to reiterate that you have to allow yourself to grieve, that grieving is not a linear process like Dr. Robinson mentioned. And for me, I like to go out in nature and find ways that I can honor my loved ones, like through rainbows. My sister comes to us, we feel like in rainbows or birds. And so I would just say to you guys, if you enjoyed the conversation today, would you please just type, if you found the webinar helpful and that you would recommend it to someone, please just type helpful in the chat room. That would allow us to just keep some metrics going and be able to provide some additional webinars and programs from Silence to Shame. I also want to mention griefshare.org. It is from a Christian perspective, but it is a wonderful platform to seek help. Also, you can go on to www.betterhelp.com, and it takes you through a series of questions, and you can find a therapist in your area. You can do therapyforblackgirls.com or psychologytoday.com, which is really great for the greater community at large. Silence to Shame has a podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and SoundCloud. We have an episode that I mentioned that features my sister on grief and loss. It is a wonderful episode, and it also features my dear friend Kate Atwood, who has an organization called Kate's Club. Kate's with an S Club, which is a great organization here in Atlanta, Georgia, and they focus on programs for grief and loss for teens and adolescents from that physical loss of a parent or a sibling. It is an extremely great program, and remember, take it one day at a time. I would just kick it over to you, Dr. Robinson, with any final words or resources that you can provide.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me. We also created a workbook for you all. Again, it gives some psychoeducation as well as a list of resources that are in our community as well as nationally. And some tips, again, remembering that grief is a full body experience. And so we've included some tips on recognizing grief from a physical, emotional, spiritual perspective, and helping you kind of walk through what your needs are. Again, we mentioned that your coping skills and strategies might need to change. And so we created that. If you go over to my IG or even my Facebook page, in the bio, we've listed the link there. We also dropped it here in the chat for you all. Again, that's 100% free. There's no pitching, nothing there. We've just compiled some resources, including some books, because again, we often need to see our story in others so that we know we're not alone, and some books are helpful for kids and adults. So we've compiled those for you. I echo some of the resources that you've already mentioned, Shanti. I would add the grief recovery method. It is a grief training program, but it also has a directory of clinicians. You'd find myself and my entire staff there as well. So we are always a resource for you. That's also linked in the workbook that we've included. And then the WINT Center, I think that it's important. The WINT Center is a local program here in DC, but they have camps for kids. They're doing some virtual work as well. I think it's important to identify the loss, because the support groups that you might find might be different if you have a loss that's symbolic versus a loss that's physical. And then the nature of the loss, there's some groups that specialize in survivors as well as those who've experienced traumatic death or traumatic losses. And so again, be mindful of that. If you all need any support, you can always reach out to me and my team. We're happy to help connect you.
Thank you so much for participating. I'm really excited to do more work with you, Dr. Robinson. So don't be surprised if Silence to Shame is calling on you some more. Everyone, again, remember to go to our website, silencetoshame.com, to just check out what we do, what we're about. If you care to make a donation, we are a small organization doing mighty work. May 5th is National Silence to Shame Day. We're very excited to have our own day where we will be raising awareness and helping to spread the message of erasing stigma. And May is Mental Health Awareness Month, so it's a wonderful opportunity for you to talk to your family about mental health, to participate in other virtual programs, alongside Silence to Shame. Follow us on Instagram at Silence the Shame, on Facebook and Twitter at SilenceTHShame. We post a lot of helpful articles and information. And again, this was the Mental Health Community Conversation Q&A. So if you liked what you heard, please share resources, helpful tips today on social media, utilizing the hashtags Silence the Shame and hashtag MHQA. Thank you guys again. We're just so grateful for you all supporting us. And we send our love and well wishes to anyone out there grieving the loss of a family member or dealing with symbolic loss. And make sure the important thing is that you don't stay in the valley, that you get the help that you need, because joy surely does come in the morning. And we are all here to help one another. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day. Thank you, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you.